Passion Harvest. Hello, passionate listeners. Welcome to Passion Harvest. I am Louisa, your host, International Passion Ambassador, and thank you for listening to this show. And if you like this episode, please do subscribe. Excitingly awesome guest today, Dr. Karen Wyatt. Dr. Karen Wyatt, for 25 years, cared for patients as a hospice doctor in nursing homes and homeless shelters, and she learned spiritual lessons from them at the end of their lives. Dr. Wyatt was inspired to write her book, What Really Matters: 7 Lessons for Living from the Stories of the Dying, which offers the 7 key lessons the dying taught her, including suffering, embrace your difficulties, and love, let your heart be broken, that's a hard one, to forgiveness, hold no resentments, and impermanence, face your fear. Dr. Wyatt also hosts End of Life University podcast, which features conversations with experts who work in all aspects of end-of-life care. She teaches that in order to live life fully, we must each overcome our fear of death and embrace the difficulties that life brings us. This is her story and this is her passion. Dr. Karen Wyatt, welcome to Passion Harvest.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to join you today.
I'm so happy, and thank you so much for being on the show. I always like to ask the guests just to start it off, just to give a bit of a background about how you got into working in homeless shelters and hospice care and working with the dying, or what even led you to, this is too many questions, what even led you to medicine in the first place?
Well, I knew from the time I was very young that I wanted to be a doctor. I don't know why. I just got that inspiration at a young age. And so I studied in family medicine, which is kind of general practice, and was very happy in that profession for the first few years until tragedy struck my life. So it was tragedy that brought me over to hospice work when my father died by suicide. And so I was completely devastated with my own grief over his death, but also with guilt, because as a doctor, I had studied some psychiatry, and I really felt that I should have been able to help my dad. Like, how could I help other patients if I couldn't help my dad somehow, one of the people I loved the most in the world? So I was just shattered after his death and really struggling to find my way through that grief. And one day I just got the inspiration to call hospice and see if they might need a volunteer, because I thought maybe if I immerse myself in death and dying and grief, I will be able to find my own way out of it, like diving into the deep end of the pool, I guess.
Yeah.
And so I started as a volunteer in hospice, and then I fell in love with that work, being with patients who were facing the end of life. And so I ended up eventually shifting completely into that line of work.
Wow, grief. I haven't experienced death of a loved one too much yet, but grief is such a incredible, powerful thing. So many people ask me, how do I get rid of my grief? How do I move through grief? Is there anything to alleviate grief that is all consuming? What is your advice?
Well, what I had to learn is that the years that I was struggling so much, I was trying to avoid the grief, actually. I was thinking that I could just make it go away by willing it away. And I remember that I used to wake up every morning and think, someday I will wake up and I will feel exactly like I felt before my dad died. And so I was constantly clinging to the past and wanting to go backwards, thinking if I can just go back to that time, everything will be okay. And it was when I got involved in hospice, I realized that's not how it works. You can't escape it and you can't go backwards or avoid it. You have to go into it and feel the pain of it and allow yourself to sit with the pain of loss and the pain of grief for a while, because that's how you gradually work your way through it and find your way to something else on the other side. And you have to allow yourself to change. You can't keep trying to be who you were before. You have to accept that loss comes to us as a motivator for changing us and helping us grow.
What a beautiful explanation. Thank you. I'm feeling a bit sad now.
Oh,
No, it's does grief, I mean, so someone who's lost someone, it gets easier. You don't still have that grief that overwhelms you with the loss of your father.
Yes. In fact, over time, I was able to just carry that. And there's still, of course, pain there if I look at that, and I miss my dad still, but I was able to make more and more sense of it and see more and more meaning in his death over time. And that was the most important thing that happened, is just the healing that comes with time, and that seeing that life does go on, and that there is a life after my father's death, and it still has beauty and meaning and value. And in fact, my father's death was one of the greatest teachers for me in my life.
And that's going to segue me onto suffering. And suffering is such a powerful, fundamental thing that we as humans all experience. Why do we suffer so much?
Well, this is just my own thought about it. That
Sure.
in a way, if as they say, we're spiritual beings having a physical experience, like we're spiritual beings first, and we've chosen to embody into physical bodies, that it's really this physical life here on planet Earth that has suffering woven into it. There's no way to avoid it. That it's part of life here on planet Earth. Things die. Everything in nature can get sick and die and get injured. And that maybe we choose it as spirits. We choose to come here intentionally so that we can experience suffering and learn how to carry it and how to grow from it. So to me, that's what I began to see, is that the times when I've suffered have been the times when I've learned the most, and I've changed the most and grown the most, and even become more my true self, more who I really am. So it's helped me embrace the idea that it's okay. It's okay to go through the pain of suffering and work our way to the other side.
I'm just thinking about what you said in pivotal moment. It's in my life when I've suffered, and no one wants suffering, but it certainly, looking back, it was not a wonderful experience, but definitely an expansive, growing experience. I can't imagine what it's like working in a hospice, not only the emotional suffering of grief, but also patients at the end of their life, that physical suffering as well. That must be very hard to watch,
Yeah.
and as a family member or even as a doctor.
One of the best parts of being in hospice is that we have a lot of training in how to alleviate suffering. So we really have a lot of tools to use. And that feels like the most powerful mission we have in hospice, is to help alleviate suffering as much as possible for the patient, and also bring comfort to the family. But then the side benefit of that is that people at the very end of life, so many of them have really amazing epiphanies and transformations that they go through as they're looking back on life and thinking through life, and how, the things that have happened and how they were connected and what a difference it made. So while we're there helping to comfort them, they're teaching us about what is important in life. And that's why I ended up writing the book, because the teaching I received from the patients was so profound.
Well, I'd love to talk about the book, and I love the title, and it sounds like a very profound book. And the 7 lessons, if you wouldn't mind discussing that. And you've already just said why you thought about writing the book or started writing a book, but if we can dive a bit more into the book, I'd love to discuss that.
Yes. Well, the first lesson that I started with is that lesson we talked about of suffering, because for me, that's what I had to understand about my own grief over my dad's death, and being in hospice and being with lots and lots of people who were going through death and dying and grief made me realize that I had to stop having self-pity and feeling sorry for myself that my dad had died, because death enters everyone's life at some point or another. And so suffering is part of it, and death and dying is part of life. And once I got through that point, I realized, in a way, it's important that we do embrace all of the difficulties and suffering that comes to us in life, because that's the only way we can move on and make something better from what has happened.
Because fighting it, as you said, or ignoring it, unfortunately, it's not going to work.
Yeah, and it can make you crazy, and it can exhaust you completely if you try to resist it and fight it. And for me, the next lesson that came along was the lesson of love. So that's lesson number 2, because I saw, first of all of my patients talked about love and how they came to see at the end of life that love was actually the thing that mattered to them more than anything else, who they loved and who they were loved by. And the patients with regrets always felt that they hadn't loved enough. They hadn't told people they loved them, or they hadn't cherished relationships that had been part of their life. They'd been careless with relationships and abandoned people in their lives. And so I realized that once I got through my suffering over my dad's death, I actually felt like I had so much more capacity to have compassion and love for other people. I was actually able to love better and more deeply, because that going through the pain of loss sort of opened my heart even more for other people and for being able to love. So that's the second lesson.
And then I just want to touch on the love one. You talk about how important it is to have a broken heart.
Yes.
In a romantic sense, I'm assuming.
Romantic, but I think other parts of life can break our hearts too. And I felt that way after my dad died. Like my heart was just broken that he had died. But that's kind of what I'm talking about. It's like actually what made me more open and more have a greater capacity for having compassion for other people and for seeing other people in pain and knowing what that pain is and being willing to engage with them and to be with them and sit with them and while they were going through that experience.
I'm just thinking these are all experiences no one wants, but you're right, they do crack your heart open and they let in more growth and expansion and light and all those things that we desire and come here for.
Yeah, and as you said, they're the things that we don't want and we dread, but in the end, if we can let down our guard just a little bit around these things that life brings us, in some ways we can enter into them more quickly and more easily in a way, and begin to start learning these lessons. And the third lesson that I think goes hand in hand with love is the lesson of forgiveness, because the more we love, the more we really will be asked to forgive, because everyone that we love will somehow disappoint us or hurt us in some way. And so I feel like those two really come together. Yeah. And so that's been a big practice for me. And for all my patients, I saw them working on that also at the end of life, figuring out, how do I forgive other people for things they've done, or how do I forgive myself for mistakes I've made in the past?
And then I think the other one was fear, moving through fear.
Yeah, that's the seventh lesson.
Sorry, not in order.
Okay.
I'm jumping ahead. Excuse me.
It doesn't. I can go through in order or skip around. It doesn't matter. But yeah, so the next lesson after forgiveness is just being present, which we talk about a lot in spiritual circles, is being in the present moment. But I found that being able to forgive the past helped me be more present, because I wasn't keeping all my attention and energy focused on something that went wrong in the past. I was able to let that go. That really helped me be more present right here, right now, in this moment. And that leads in a way to purpose, because once we're living more in the present moment, we're also more tuned in to, what am I here to do? What is life about? And we have to be able to connect with the present moment in a deep way in order to start to get the intuition and the guidance and the hints that tell us what we're here for. And maybe our passion, as I think you would say. Sometimes we can't hear it because we're so preoccupied with what went wrong in the past that we don't hear what the messages that are coming to us right now in the present moment. So from there, we go on to the lesson of surrender, which is learning to just let go of our attachments and our expectations to how things should be, and accepting what is and how things are right now in our lives. And then the last lesson is the lesson of impermanence and accepting that everything changes in life. everything is constantly changing and nothing really lasts. So except love. So that we have to get used to that part of life, that things will always change, and we have to be prepared and ready and willing for change to happen.
Absolutely beautiful. These are all universal truths and fundamental to why we're here in our existence. So I just love how you've composed them all together and explained them in a really beautiful way, and in your incredible book.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's interesting because the inspiration did come from just sitting with patients and hearing them talk about, excuse me, about their experiences and about how things look to them from that vantage point. And the rest of us don't have that same vantage point of knowing I'm at the very end and I'm looking backwards now, and it's all making sense. I'm putting all the pieces of the puzzle together of life in a way, but knowing how they could do it and that there's an opportunity to put it all together at the end of life made me realize, what if I started trying to put the pieces together now and started to fit this together and started to understand what's important in life right now.
I guess and be the best version of yourself you could be, and offer others so much hope as well.
Yes, yeah. And I love that idea of in each moment trying to be the best me I can be, even though, a year from now, there might be a better me that I'm able to be then, but it's whoever I am right now. That's important.
Beautiful. I just wanted to touch on something you mentioned briefly. In your opinion, obviously, well, this show's about you today. Do you believe in reincarnation, and do we come here in this life for certain purposes or passions or?
Well, I believe that we come here to learn, and I can accept the idea of reincarnation. It kind of makes sense to me,
Mm-hmm.
but I do believe there's I believe there's a spiritual realm, or that our spirits somehow go on after the physical body dies. And that's from being with a lot of patients who are dying and hearing them talk about seeing loved ones in the room who are there with them or who've come for them. And, it tells me there's something beyond just this physical existence. So I really do believe there's more to life than that. And then I believe that there's a spiritual purpose for us to be here. It's not just, it's not just our going through the physical aspect of life, but
just what we see with our eyes is much more.
Yes, exactly.
And I mean, you talk about all these fundamental truths and suffering and all these importances. I know the American Indians talk about when someone dies, it is actually a blessing to those ones that are left behind, as hard as that is. Have you found that as well?
And it's interesting because on a personal level, I found that with my own mother when she died, which was, it's been 7 years now since she died. So that was, my dad's death was sudden and couldn't prepare for that at all. My mom's death was gradual, so we had a lot of time together to prepare. And her death really felt like almost like an accomplishment because of the way she lived her life, and she was prepared to die and ready to die. And I honestly, there was this moment of joy, like she had finished her journey and she was moving on. And I don't know, the joy that came when she was at the very end of life, along with sorrow, it somehow transformed me. And it's hard for me to describe, but somehow I let go of every little shred of anger I'd ever had at my mom, or any blame or hurt or negative feelings toward her. It was really powerful. And so I love that idea of saying they leave behind a blessing, because that's really what it felt like to me. I was able, after her death, to just move on and be completely free of old issues that I'd carried around for a long time.
I might have to reflect on that myself, actually. That's a whole nother episode.
Yeah.
So many people are fearful of death. I guess the question is why, and people that are in the hospice and are imminently dying, do you find many of them at a certain point when they have to surrender, they're not so fearful anymore?
Yes, I was very impressed that most of my patients seem to lose their fear of death the closer they got to it. And so I think they were really beginning to have more spiritual experiences when they would sleep, or which they spent a lot more and more time sleeping in a dreamlike state.
Mm-hmm.
And seem to come back from those states when they would wake up as calmer and more aware that something beautiful was happening for them. And that was very reassuring to witness that as they went through that experience. But it's commonplace in our society for us to be afraid of death, and our society is really hides death from us. We don't experience it in the way people in India and actually over 100 years ago in our society, people used to die at home, and we experienced death even as children of loved ones in the home, and even held wakes and funerals in the home. So death was much more part of everyday life. But now we live lives that are really kind of sanitized from death. We are able to hide it from view, so we haven't grown up being aware of death and being familiar with it. And that's why for many of us, it comes as a shock when someone we love, we find out is going to die, or when someone has died. We're just not prepared for it at all because we haven't given it much thought. And so that's part of my mission, is to encourage people to read these stories about patients in hospice who are facing their deaths, and also to see that time can be really beautiful for people and really transformative, to help people have less fear about their own death when it does come, but about death in general. And so my thinking is the first way to deal with fear around death is simply to get educated about it, maybe by reading, by listening to conversations like ours, and being able to talk about it a little bit more, but also to experience it. So if someone does have a loved one who's dying, to not, maybe it's an aunt or uncle or someone a little bit more distant than the immediate family, to take those opportunities to go and visit and be there and be with that person, to not be afraid of those situations, because you can learn so much even in just a short visit, and being with someone. It can help you so much with that fear.
That's a great point. And on that point, I also wanted to touch on someone who potentially has been diagnosed with certain diseases, or there is the potential to die, that is very fearful. What's your advice to those people?
It's somewhat similar in the idea that we have to be able to look at the possibility of death, because we don't want to run away from it even while we're sick, and hope and hang our hopes on maybe too many treatments or futile treatments, trying to ignore or avoid death, but to accept, it's possible that I could die from this. And that's a reality. Everyone dies someday. It's possible I could, but meanwhile, I want to live as much as I can. And if we are constantly in a state of fear of death, that actually really interferes with enjoying life in the moment and making the most of life. So I feel like it's important to be able to, for all of us, even if we don't have a terminal illness right now, to know someday I am going to die, but meanwhile, I'm going to live the best I can right now and get everything out of life. And I think that's the attitude we need to hold on to. And if we're overwhelmed with fear, it's hard to get to that place where we can say, I'm going to live every moment I can right now.
Interesting. And this is kind of left of field, and I know you're a doctor. There's a lot of theories about this, that particularly with dis-ease, it's created, obviously it can be genetic, but it is created, dis-ease is from an emotional standpoint as well. What are your thoughts on that? And people have asked me a couple of times, I have this diagnosis. If I change my whole life, if I change my perception on reality, can I remove this dis-ease that I've been diagnosed with? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I see it as a big, complex picture with lots of different factors that lead to illness and disease. And so there's definitely an emotional component and a spiritual component for all of us, and definitely lifestyle, even diet and exercise and how we live our lives, how committed we are to integrity, to living an authentic life. I think all of those are factors. And again, you mentioned genetics, that can be a factor as well. But I still think there's a mystery about illness. And for some of us, and for some of my patients, they lived absolutely the best life they possibly could. They were the best people. They took the best care of themselves, and still they got a terminal illness.
Yeah.
And no matter what they did, it didn't go away. And so in their case, it was, I just don't want to give people a false hope that if you do this list of things, your disease will go away, because not necessarily. Some of them began to feel like, one of my patients said to me, she had breast cancer, and she said, I understand now that my breast cancer is the most important thing that happened to me on my spiritual journey. Wow. And because it's helped me learn so much that I need to know. And she said, whether I recover from it and live longer, or whether I die in the near future, it doesn't matter, because I'm learning every day from this process I'm going through. That was profound to me. That
Talk about surrender. Wow.
Yeah, that she could be in that place. And so she was just remarkable. She lived for 7 years with her cancer. And meanwhile, she had so many deep talks with her children and her husband. Like, they were all so bonded and so prepared for what was going to happen. And I saw her a few days before she died, and she whispered to me, I'm not sad. Is that okay? And I said, yes, it's okay. And she said, because I always just assumed that when you're at this place and it's time to go, and that you would just feel sad about everything you were leaving. And she said, but it all feels perfect. It all feels like I've had the perfect life that I was meant to have, and I'm not sad about it. And again, that blew me away. That was so amazing to hear her have that realization that this is how it is, and I accept it all, and I'm not sad about it, and I'm not scared. I'm ready. This is what life has brought to me. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. What an amazing perception on life. I mean, just absolutely beautiful. I'd love to hear if you be happy to talk about it, some other patients that really have had a profound impact on you.
Oh gosh, there were so many. One patient.
I just have to say, I'm sorry to interrupt. You are remarkable what you're doing. Amazing, amazing.
Oh, thank you. Well, I accept that with humility, because the work itself is so gratifying. And it really was my dad's death that made me able to be part of this work, to be able to be here and be in this place with patients. And so I feel like all of it was sort of preparing me and training me to do the work. So I'm humble about that, but thank you. One of my patients was a man who, he had cancer of the face that had actually eaten away parts of his face, if you can imagine. It was horrific. He had to wear a bandage that covered his face because the appearance was terrible. And I remember thinking, before I ever saw him, like, oh, I don't know if I can go see his face. Like, how will I react? Will I be appalled, or will I, when I see what his face looks like, and how will I feel about that? And how does he feel about that? And I imagined for myself, if I were in his shoes, I would be so bitter and angry and upset, and I would probably never want to ever see anyone or go out of my house. And yet I walked into his house, and he was the most gracious, loving, beautiful person, and just welcomed everyone in and loved each moment of his life, in spite of having this horrible disfigurement of his face. And it just he was just such an inspiration to me that, gosh, I think that all of these small things in my life matter so much that, oh, it couldn't possibly go on. What if my hair turns gray like it has now? What if I have a pimple on my face? All of these things, superficial things about appearance that I cared about so much. He taught me how little that matters, and that as soon as I visited him, I can't even remember what his face looked like, the disfigurement looked like, because all I could see was how beautiful he was as a person. And so that told me, I want to work on myself so that I can have that kind of beauty myself someday, that, that just glows and shines to other people.
Well, I feel you've achieved that.
Oh,
Definitely.
Thank you. That's kind of you.
I need my tissue box next to me here because I'm trying to stop myself from crying so many times. So what, in your opinion, what happens when we die?
Well, it's been interesting. Again, this came from just observing patients, and at the very end of the dying process, we call it active dying in hospice. That's what we refer to it to, and it can last 3 days to 2 weeks or so. It really seems to me that patients at that time are in two different worlds. They're partly here in this world, but they're also in the spiritual world that I believe in, and they seem to go back and forth, as at times they'll be completely unresponsive, no matter what we do or say to them. They seem completely gone, but other times they come back and they'll talk to us. And so it's in those times that they talk about seeing a beautiful light or experiencing love. And for me, it's as if someone similar to a person who's had a near-death experience that was really beautiful, the way they talk about it. So what I have come to understand is those last few days of the dying process, the person is really preparing to leave the body and go full time into this spiritual realm, and they go back and forth for a while as they're preparing for that. And then I do believe that consciousness, or the vital force or energy, whatever you want to call it, or the spirit, the soul, whatever it is, definitely continues on, and the body just falls away at the moment of death, as if, this is clothing that's not needed anymore for the soul, and this transformation takes place. And it's interesting how much the body really changes as soon as the soul leaves. The body almost looks like it was made of wax, or not something that was even real, in spite of just being animated a few moments before. So at any rate, that's how I view it, that the soul definitely continues, and there's something more that happens.
Yes, that's just a lovely way of putting it. I wanted to talk also about the offerings that you have. I think one's called End of Life University, and the 7 lessons, which is what we've spoken about, and Wisdom Path. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yes, I started an interview series long ago after I first wrote the book, What Really Matters. I realized that a lot of people didn't want to read the book because they didn't understand anything about death and dying and were afraid of it. So I started interviewing other people who worked in the death and dying field and posting interviews on my website. And ultimately it became a podcast. So I still have that as a podcast now, called End of Life University. Then through that same title, I offer some courses. I do webinars and workshops from time to time. People can sign up for the mailing list. And
I'm going to put all your links in the show notes for everyone that's listening, by the way. Anything that's related to you, I'll put all the links for people to connect.
Thank you. And then I created this course. It's called the 7 Lessons Wisdom Path, which it's kind of a deeper dive into those 7 lessons. And so there are 8 modules, one for each of the 7 lessons. And the 8th one is just kind of putting all of them together into one picture of how, when we work on these lessons, if we're really working on ourselves all at one time and our spiritual growth. So it's an online self-paced course that people can take if they want to go through and work in more detail on the 7 lessons.
And I'm just thinking, what I love about that, it's not only if you're dying or you have a loved one or a friend that's dying, but even if you're not dying, these lessons are so fundamental and universal truths that I think everyone really should do them.
Yes, that's what I found for me as I was gathering all these stories and observing these lessons from my patients. I started to wonder, is this only something you learn when you're dying, when you're on your
Mm.
deathbed? Or is it possible to actually work on these lessons and learn them now? So I experimented with myself for years to see, can I learn more about forgiveness? Can I learn more about surrender if I start working on it now, so that I'm already good at those things by the time I do get to the end of life.
Mm.
So after many years of working on my own growth, I realized this is something worth sharing and telling other people about, so that they too could start to work on these lessons. And I think accepting that we'll die one day is part of it.
Yeah.
Accepting that death is just part of this life here on planet Earth is kind of where we have to begin.
I just wanted to ask you, since you've done so much work on yourself and created this incredible compendium of lessons from the dying, if we all experience conflict and contrast, however severe or not severe it may be, if it comes by to you, do you feel that you're much more able to cope with it? Do you embrace it? What do you do?
Well, I will say, so say it's with my husband, for example, the person I'm most likely to
Yeah.
have conflict with initially, I get right into the middle of it and get upset about things, but I'm able to go off by myself and process it, because through the way that I work on forgiveness is really trying to take a step back from whatever conflict happened and look at it and understand it, like, what was going on with me? What was I feeling? Why
Mm.
did I react? Why did I get so upset about that? Why did I react that way? Then trying to understand what was happening, what might have been happening for the other person. Maybe what was going on for that person at that time. How were they viewing it and what happened for them? And the more I can see a bigger and bigger picture of what happened, and I can see more clearly, the more easily the anger just goes away. And I realize, oh, well, I was still feeling upset about something that happened 2 years ago, actually, and I brought it into this experience. And, I get a lot more clarity, and that's when I can start to see what I need to work on. For me, I use a journal as my tool. I go immediately and I write about it. I write down the whole thing in my journal, because it really helps me look at myself better.
Mm.
And I have to be honest with myself in my journal. Like, what was I really thinking? Why did I really say that? And was that a good thing, or would I like to apologize and get over that? So anyway, definitely learning these lessons and learning about forgiveness, for one thing, has helped me a lot with conflict, because what I discovered with forgiveness is that I already have enough things from the past that I'm working through. I don't want to add more to it now.
Mm.
So I try in the moment, day to day, to resolve things so that I'm not hanging on to bitterness or anger, to even more of it, and adding layers onto what I'm already working on from the past. So I feel really committed to that idea. I don't want any more of that kind of bitterness. So I want to fix it as quickly as I can.
I agree. It's a no thank you from me as well. I find myself, I do that as well. So it's almost like people get too caught up in the humanness, the what isness of life. And if you can analyze and detach yourself from it and observe from an outside perspective, it makes it a lot easier instead of
Yeah.
being so involved in the situation.
Yeah, exactly. Before my mom died, and I was upset with her. Wasn't talking to her about it, but I was feeling upset and hurt by something she said. And one day, this thought came into my head, which was, "What if it's all me?" And then suddenly I realized, like, whoa, it was powerful. Like, what if I'm feeling hurt by what my mom said? What if that's actually just me and how I interpret what she said? What if I already feel bad about myself, and so I'm just listening to her words in a distorted way? What if she doesn't think anything? What if she's not trying to hurt me? What if it's me? And suddenly that was mind blowing, because I realized I can fix these things inside of me. I don't have to ask her to change. I can fix how I'm looking at it. And so that was empowering to think, if I start with me and what I'm feeling, and then how have my own experiences in the past colored how I look at these situations I'm in right now? And is it that I am mad at myself, so I think my mom's mad at me? So anyway, that question now goes through my head all the time. What if it's just me? What if this is just me creating this? And
I love that. I call it like portals of perception. It's how we perceive things. We create our own reality, and we create our own story. We're the story of our life. We're the navigator. So again, that's detaching yourself and just observing from an exterior perspective.
Yeah. And it's so important right now, everything that's happening around the world and we're going through in our various societies, there's so much blaming going on and so much anger at other groups of people, at least here in the US, that's really happening
Everywhere.
It's just the wrong thing to do. Like, start with yourself, like, oh, what if it's me? What if this is my perception of things? And how can I alter that so I just don't have to get upset? I don't have to be angry at anyone.
I love that. I've asked all the questions. I'm just wondering if there's anything in particular you'd like to talk to the Passion Harvest audience about.
Well, okay, I'll say a couple of things.
Please
One was
do.
that idea, which in a way it sounds mundane or trite because everyone talks about being in the present moment, but I saw it so powerfully with my patients, how for them, knowing that they didn't have very much time left made every single moment of life absolutely precious to them. And, every sunset, they had to stop and watch the entire sunset until all the color had faded away. And when they ate an ice cream cone, they enjoyed every single drop of the ice cream and tasted it fully and savored it. They didn't let themselves get distracted by other things. They were just fully in the moment. And as much as before I thought I was, living in the present moment, they really showed me there's a deeper way to engage with everything in life. And from there, I figured out that my purpose, the whole reason I'm here really is to learn how to live life that deeply. And when I'm doing that, I am my true self. I'm who I came here to be if I'm living in the moment. And I don't have to stop and figure out, should I keep practicing medicine? Should I do this? Should I do that? What's my next career choice? If I focus more on just being in this moment as deeply as I can and being me, I'm already on the right path. I'm already doing the right thing and doing what I came here to do. So I feel like that's how we fuel our passion, is loving each moment of life that we have, no matter how many we get to have.
That was so beautiful. You've already answered my last question. If someone wants to follow their passion, be in the now. It's such a beautiful message. Really, really. Yeah. I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. It's profound insights.
Oh, thank you so much. It's my pleasure.
Dr. Karen Wyatt, thank you so much for being on Passion Harvest.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure.
What a beautiful gift you are to the world too. I just want to thank you on behalf of everyone. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It's my privilege to talk to you. So take care.
Thank you. If you like this episode, please do subscribe for weekly passionate, inspirational interviews.